This is part four of workshop on the economics of legal immigration reform for one of the homeschool debate leagues. I ended the last session looking at the book Closed Borders, subtitled The Contemporary Assault on Freedom of Movement. And this is a historical look that through history, migration was the norm throughout the world, and it's only in recent centuries that nation states have restricted migration, and particularly since World War I. Before World War I, open movement across the world. After World War I, not only were these passports and restrictions put on immigration in the US in 24, but also in the Islamic world where there's so much conflict and disaster now, that was the first time that nation state borders were erected under the Western pressure and Turkey. But before that, Islamic peoples moved from country to country. They could move anywhere in the Islamic world. They had their religious background, but didn't, and family and culture and tribal things, but not nation states restricting commercial transactions across borders. And that's actually the story that Alan Dowdy begins with Closed Borders, is a Syrian who suddenly is cut off from the trading networks that had been his livelihood and that of his parents and ancestors, because new borders restricted trade, and now there were tariffs and trade barriers that changed his life. Okay, so history of migration, and this, again, the supporters of free trade argue that the flow of goods and services is doesn't need anybody directing it, doesn't need government saying, well, we'll only allow this much steel in the country this year and only this much wheat. Decisions about how much trade, how much commerce are generally made by prices and markets. The demand for wheat is higher in the US. People import it, or farmers here grow it. Demand for corn is strong around the world. Corn prices go up. That leads farmers to plant more. That leads more being exported. So defenders of the free movement of goods are similar to defenders of free movements of people. Not that people are equated to goods, but people choose to buy and sell. People choose to invest in this country or other countries. And why not have people choose whether to move from Washington to Oregon or Washington to Mexico and so forth? So this idea of the accumulation of millions of individual decisions will produce better social results. This is the Hayekian sort of knowledge problem, that markets reveal information and allow people to coordinate and work together due to prices. What are the prices involved in migration? Well, wage rates. The wage rate in Australia is, $50 an hour. People will want to migrate to Australia from surrounding countries from around the world to take advantage of those high wages. Those people moving to Mexico or to Australia to take those jobs tends to push labor rates down to the market rate. Who would be against that? Well, perhaps the workers or the unions that are benefiting in Australia from the high labor rates. They don't want to compete with immigrants from Indonesia, Malaysia, or China. So they set up strict immigration barriers, as Australia has, to keep their wage rates up. Now, you say, well, yeah, but that benefits the workers in Australia. Well, it benefits some workers, but those high wage rates hurt consumers who have to pay more for the goods and services they buy. It hurts the companies who would be more competitive on world markets if they could have access to more workers. So that story of free trade in goods is similar to the free movement in people. So the movement of people is sort of a thermostat of relative pressures. And it's often, the refugee crisis currently in the news with Syrians and people trying to escape North Africa, the turmoil there. There's been turmoil through the history of the world. Bad governments, dictators, invasions, droughts, floods. When those things wreck an area, people move away. They pack their goods and they move to another part of the country. But in Africa, suddenly they run up against trade borders. They can't legally cross from one region to the next because there's a border there between countries. Even if their particular tribe has settled that area for centuries, suddenly with the new borders in Africa and elsewhere, there's limits on movement. So that's, again, it's that's the history story. Things used to be different. In Closed Borders, it's fascinating. In the beginning of it, Alan Dowdy says, and partway through the introduction, that just 1,000 years ago, look at the world just 1,000 years ago. There were no Germans in Berlin. There were no Thais in Bangkok. The Bantu-speaking peoples in Africa hadn't migrated. There were no Europeans in the New World or in Argentina or Australia. This migration that happened dramatically in the 1700s, 1800s, 1900s has changed the world, and that migration, the Hungarians came from the Asian steppes into Hungary. These migrations of people all over the world have happened in the last 1,000 years, and they continue. Now, for history of migration in the U.S., I recommended the book by Roger Daniels, Guarding the Golden Door. And this is seems an unbiased book to me by a historian. He's not pro-immigration or anti-immigration, but he's a historian. So he looks at the trade-offs or the history of migration to the U.S. And of course, it was railroads and steamships that dropped the cost of people moving, 70%, that allowed so many people who had been too poor to take a sailing ship to the U.S. and have food for 3 weeks and get to the coast of Europe. Suddenly the railroad could bring them hundreds of miles to the coast. Steamships could take them from southern Europe, eastern Europe, to America. So we got a lot more immigrants, as did Argentina, Australia, South Africa, New Zealand, and a lot different immigrants, people from cultures that were not Northern European Protestant, which was the norm in America when the immigration boom began in the 1800s, late 1800s. So 1895 to 1920, 145,000 Romanians come to the U.S., and of course many more went to Western Europe because railroads and steamships gave very poor people an opportunity to go to places where wages were higher, where opportunity seemed stronger. There's a new book coming out on the costs of this. Obviously, a lot of people were disappointed. Many went back. Some went back with money and started successful lives back in Romania. Others made money in the U.S., but there were hard things as well. People left their friends and their family, and immigration is always a tragedy, even when it is opportunity. 450,000 Hungarians come to the U.S., have a huge impact in the U.S. economy. This is the world's largest migration to the time. In the 1800s through World War I, Europeans to North and South America. Now, immigration levels go down, then they come up again in the 1980s and 90s, and that's sort of the recent story we've got of the resurgence of movement around the world after the lockdown that happened in World War I, after the war, in World War II. This is, as migrants came here, they went to their churches. The Ukrainians went to the local Ukrainian church. There were fraternal organizations, mutual benefit societies. This is one from Chicago that Bulgarians were part of. So this is 1893. The writer, a Bulgarian writer, wrote about going to the World Columbia Exposition in Chicago, and that electrified young people in Bulgaria. There was a place where all these amazing things would happen, and that led to immigration to the U.S. of Bulgarians. Some 50,000 migrated between 1903 and 1910 from Turkish-occupied Macedonia and Bulgarian proper. However, they never boomed the way others did from Southern and Eastern Europe. The 1924 National Origins Immigration Act limited the number to 100 a year, because the country of origin, national origin, said we're going to have the Congress passed, we're going to have a policy that forces immigrants into categories that only match the people already here, so that we preserve American character. But instead of using the 1920 census or 1910 or 1900, they used the 1890 census, which locked out all the Bulgarians who had come and most of others from Eastern Europe. So it was to say, let's go backwards, let's stop new immigration, let's sort of ignore all these people that have come here, or at least let's stop them from continuing to come. So from 1924 to 65, under 8,000 Bulgarians admitted to the U.S. And I mentioned Bulgarians here as an example. You can do the research for Hungarians, Romanians, Greeks, Italians, other countries as well. Um, so if you look on the website now, there's been a resurgence of Bulgarians. Boston, New York, Chicago, around the country, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and there's this Bulgarian community website where people can network and so forth. This is a Bulgarian friend of mine who's with her two kids. Now, when critics of high immigration, like the Gumballs guy that I'll be talking about on the internet, they call for a return to traditional levels of immigration. And what they mean is this area in blue. For them, traditional is what they grew up with. People who were in their 60s, 70s, and 80s, they grew up in mostly Anglo-American America because immigration had been shut off since 1924. So my town in Burien, where I am, it was virtually all Anglo when I was a kid. There were lots of immigrants here from Italy after World War II. Soldiers brought orphans back and so forth. But by and large, very few Hispanics, very few people from other countries. So that was the tradition that I grew up with. The town I'm in, Burien, is now has lots of Hispanics, lots of Mexican restaurants from El Salvador and other countries. It's got lots of people from former Yugoslavia here, lots of Bosnians, lots of Somalis, people from Sudan, Africans, lots of Sikhs, others from India. So the mix of people has changed dramatically. The language are more diverse, the restaurants are more diverse. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Well, I like it. People who come here, though they maybe think it rains too much and it's too cold for people who come from the south, still it's a land of opportunity for them. They came here voluntarily, and most of them have the money to go back voluntarily if they wanted to, but they prefer it here. So who's hurt by that? Well, people who want the town to stay the same it was when they were a kid, maybe they're upset by it, but do they have a right to exclude these immigrants? And again, when they say tradition, they're talking post 1924. Look at the traditions on the chart from before. This is the number of immigrants per year per 1,000 Americans. And the reason we use this, not absolute numbers, is the U.S. population has grown dramatically since the 1830s, since the 1930s. And when we talk about the impact of immigration, it's a relative thing in numbers. That is, if you're in a town with 10,000 people and 1,000 immigrants come the next year, that's a pretty big deal. There's build houses and find jobs and one thing and another. But if you're in a town of 100,000 people and 1,000 immigrants show up, that's hard to notice. So as the U.S. population doubled and doubled again, more immigrants have less impact. So what we're looking at is the number of immigrants per 1,000 people that's already here. So we are in the 1990s and 2000s, just about half of what we had 1900 to 1910. So the impact is much less in America. Plus, we're far wealthier. We have bigger homes. The standard of living is much higher. So it's an impact, and it's important, and people are concerned or think about it, but it's far less than what America had in its earlier tradition, which was, let's say, from the 1840s to the early 1920s. So what we